So when we think of data quality issues, we really think of it through this lens of these 5 different dimensions: completeness, validity, internal consistency, external consistency, and anomaly detection. And we'll drill down on what each one of these mean with actual examples, just to make this a little bit more concrete. So next slide, please. So when we think of completeness, this is perhaps the simplest of the dimensions. Are there missing values, right? If there's missing values, that's going to create critical issues. But oftentimes, for whatever reason, these things aren't checked for. So are we missing social security numbers for employees? Are we missing hire and termination dates? Are we missing rates of pay that are critical for performing affordability calculations? So that's completeness, very simple. The second dimension is validity. So when we say validity, we mean, does the data conform with its schematic requirements? So to make that a little simpler, a social security number should have 8 digits. A zip code should have 5 to 9 digits, depending on how the system stores it. A state code should have 2 digits. Very simply, does that data point just match the schematic requirements of that field? So checking for things around this. And the concept is simple, but if you have thousands of employees or thousands of records, it's very helpful to have a system that can perform this in a very quick and automated fashion, these types of checks. Next slide, please. The third is this idea of consistency of information across data silos for the same data element. So we talked about how oftentimes employers do have different technology systems or platforms. And when we talk about consistency of information across silos, we're talking about, does the data point match in, for example, payroll versus ben admin? Does the legal name, for example, that links back to social security number match in payroll versus the benefits administration? The legal name is going to be critical because that legal name is what gets populated on the 1095-C schedule. So these discrepancies, and again, we generally see a 5 to 10% discrepancy level between payroll and benefits administration. They need to be resolved to be able to adequately arrive at a single source of truth. So next slide. The fourth dimension is this notion of consistency of information between data fields. And so do data fields make sense in the context of other data fields or information? And so these questions are generally domain specific. The algorithmic flagging process should be created by domain knowledge experts that really understand the data in the context of, in our case, as we're speaking here today, the Affordable Care Act compliance process. So, but to make this more concrete, as an example, many times we see that the hire and termination dates don't make sense when compared to the actual wage and hour patterns. And if there were no check being ran, then those hire and termination dates would just be populated into a system, and they would be used to calculate employment periods, which really form the entire foundation of the narrative that's communicated to the IRS on the 1095-C schedule for an employee. And so the hire and termination dates, they end up being inaccurate because people leave and go, and as personnel is tasked with making those updates, sometimes the system doesn't allow them to track multiple hire termination dates, or other times it's just overwritten. Sometimes we see organizations where they tell themselves, oh, well, so perhaps if they have a high proportion of variable hour employees, their employees come and go, and they don't really track the rehire and re-termination dates, because they just have this sense that, well, the employee will leave for a few months and they'll come back. And so there's these discrepancies that exist, and it's important to be identifying those discrepancies between the hire and term dates and the wage and hour patterns. Other examples are discrepancies between the enrollment periods and the eligibility periods. So again, these are all algorithmically flagged. It makes it much easier to catch discrepancies if you're able to do it in an automated fashion, as opposed to having to go employee by employee. So next slide. The last dimension is this notion of anomaly detection. So there's really 2 categories of anomaly detection. One is identifying unlikely values, so values that are just very infrequent from a statistical perspective, that may make sense when viewed through the lens of the other four dimensions, but are just very rare occurrences. So for example, if one person's being paid an extra paycheck every other month, but no one else is, or an employee is listed as working 450 hours for a month, but everyone else is working 190 hours on average. So they're, well outside of two standard deviations from that statistical average. Another category is values that are just impossible, right? So, for example, if an employee is listed as working 800 hours of service for a month, that can't be true because in a month with 30 days is only 720 hours. So just flagging these types of occurrences so that they can be investigated further. The data can be cleansed, ingested, and re-ingested into the platforms, and that way the ACA analysis that takes place is accurate.